Hello there, David, Beth. Welcome to the show. It's been a long time coming. Now, normally I would ask people to give a brief biography of themselves, but I want you to give a long biography of yourself because I find your biography is very interesting. So how did you get into magic and where did it all start?
Well, glad to hang out with you guys today. So, where did I start? Yeah, where did it start, basically? Um, so, long intro would be, I was born and raised in Africa, and hopefully not boring your viewers. Um, it was kind of an intense time when I was actually born there. I was born in Angola, and it was basically the last days of the Portuguese colonial reign until they were kicked out. So of course, it was a intense time for everyone involved. And From that time onwards, my parents were infatuated with Africa. They loved Africa. They loved African cultures, spiritual systems, tribal beliefs, and just generally, African culture. So we ended up going back to Africa in regular intervals. So I lived in Nigeria, also as a child and a teenager, and later on in Kenya as well. My father, back in those days, were then, now he's retired, of course. He was a representative of the German Secret Service. Now I'm allowed to say it. Back in the days, even I didn't know about it. But so that was something that brought us to Africa, and also brought interesting people into our home very often, from artists to obscure types, who were important, of course, I guess, for the course of work my father was involved in. So I was raised in a very open-minded household when it came to spiritual or philosophical topics. I wasn't really involved in any religious upbringing, or my parents weren't very religious at all. My father was a Catholic, my mother a Lutheran, but no way practicing, and kind of rebellious. My father especially kind of rebellious towards any type of religious, doctrinal, churchy environment. And he was very interested in Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and these kinds of things. And my mother was just generally an artist type, very open-minded towards things. And so we didn't really talk about religion much in our family, but we had a lot of philosophy books and a lot of, apart from philosophy books, we had a lot of books about, like, I guess things that were in vogue in the 60s and 70s, like Allan Kardec, stuff like that, Spiritism, and, kind of like books from all trades, which would look at, people's belief systems and where you could question the, reality of life, and, what it means to be a human in the universe and stuff like this. So all these questions were important to my parents, and the upbringing I had was basically colored by a library that would reflect it. While at the same time, my parents, as I said before, were very, very, very involved in researching and getting exposed to African traditional culture. So they had a lot of friends and also associates who were, I don't know, leaders of their own spiritual environments, like people from the Ifa community or Voodoo or other places. And we would very often on the weekends go to festivities in the villages or other places, and just basically be present when they had all their religious ceremonies, as far as one could be present at those ceremonies. And this was also something that made a huge impression on me, because when we said before in our private conversation, when you are a child, you are very open-minded, I guess, compared to when you're an adult and you have your fixed opinions. And depending on the environment you're in when you are a young person, it kind of colors the atmospheres that you soak up and kind of start build your personality as well. So while I was not exposed to a doctrinal upbringing, in a churchly upbringing, I was strongly exposed to African spirituality in different aspects as they impacted on me through exposure to lots of rituals, festivities, but also people who worked, for example, for our household. You kind of start witnessing things that are very unusual in a Western environment. People claiming that, one person would bewitch another, and the cook would claim that the gardener bewitched him, and he would get sick, and there was no remedy that could help him. The doctors would be called, and nobody could do anything. And he said, like, well, the doctors can help me. It's witchcraft, and I'm gonna die. My parents and of course a Westerner looks at this with, it can't be, there must be something mentally or physically problematic which can be solved by scientific solutions. And even like embassy doctors would be brought in, who also couldn't do anything, believing of course that maybe a doctor from Germany has better skills than a doctor there. And then at last resort, one would maybe then search the living quarters of the opposing faction, the accused, because people would live in our compound in their own little apartments. And one actually would find then magical charms designed to harm the other competitor in the household. And once that was then taken out and destroyed, or in other ways rendered ineffective, immediately the people would get well, and everything would be miraculously healed and solved. So many such circumstances, as a child, were happening around me. And it's not that you literally remember them, oh, this is now happening, but they were just happening as a background to your life. And you would have people from universities, professors, politicians. In Africa, everyone believes in magic, everyone believes in the spirits, everyone believes in the gods. It's not, and you could be even a Christian, but you're a Christian on one hand, but you also tied to your traditional beliefs, and very often it's just a mixture. But so you are exposed to an environment where reality has a much deeper layer than reality in the Western world. Apart from having a rational dimension in which people they operate, especially when they are highly educated, they also have access or exposed to a dimension and layer of reality which is 100% at odds with that rationalized, intellectual, scientific reality that has basically characterized modernity. So they live basically in two different worlds, and they collide, and sometimes unhealthily so, but very often opening up different fields of experience. And me growing up in such a world, basically, on the one hand, in a very rational German household, which, however, was very philosophically open-minded, and then, however, in a world of an African environment where other dimensions of life were still accessible. And maybe we'll talk later about it anyways, layers and dimensions of life other people would consider superstitious or infantile, or backwards, whatever. However, other people may characterize it very differently. Me, for example, people being swayed still by other things in the universe, which are some are accessible. So this was a very powerful environment in which I grew up, in which I guess deep within the recesses of my personality created already a certain type of interest or tendency, which later then in life popped up more strongly. So when I then was, I don't know, in later years, high school, towards the end of high school, I was a total metal dude, of course, and then you encounter Aleister Crowley, Ozzy Osbourne song about
He
Aleister
says it
Crowley.
wrong though. He says Crowley, doesn't he, instead of Crowley?
Crowley.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I
He
remember
did it
that.
wrong. He's British, though. He should know better, right?
Yeah, I know. He should have known better. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Could you even find esoteric
And now,
books in
yeah,
Africa?
and now comes one of these cool episodes, which I like to, retell, because it was kind of curious. It was something like, I became interested in these magical topics because, of course, like Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne, and and I was living in Kenya at that time, in a high school where you had a lot of missionary kids,
Mm.
like evangelical kind of missionary kids. The parents were off, in the Rift Valley or other places, converting, the African in need for salvation, in their heads, and their children would be left in a boarding school in Nairobi, going to my school, and trying to convert everyone around them too. So of course, my natural tendency was to oppose. Of course, I also believed it was kind of stuck up and conservative values, and everything kind of I was rebelling against in my youth. So naturally, I tended towards everything which also would kind of like antagonize them. So dark imagery, Satanism, stuff like that. I remember one day my father came home from work and he was like, David, the vice ambassador and the headmaster, they kind of called me and they said, you were actually started to operate a satanic cult in school. Like, and he was laughing. He's like, "What the fuck?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's actually not really true." Because they had like, me and like another guy who was my acolyte, who would just go around, he'd be like, Satan will take your soul. He would tell this to the missionary, people. And me, I had long hair, and I would say like, I don't believe in your God. And so, people would, and I had like weird friends, and like I would virtually be acquainted with a lot of German school kids, but my main friends were Kenyans.
Mm.
And of course, that was also, I would hang out with like Indian guys and black guys, and it was kind of like my environment was way odd, compared to their traditional expat environment.
Mm.
So this was like, and then once I finished high school, I did an internship in Nairobi for German broadcast, like radio.
Mhm.
And I was living in that weird place, and I needed a book to read. So I would go to that weird Indian bookstore, kind of a little hole in the wall, piece of shit place, dirty as fuck, like, like these like a thousand times read paperbacks and nothing else. Usually, I was going for like a Clive Cussler or something, or some of these rubbishy books. And then I saw this kind of like weird big green book, like literally somewhere, and I couldn't even see what it was. So I just went there, grabbed it because I like to read a lot, so I would read fast. And it was a big book, so I thought like, let me see what it is. So I took the book, and it said, and mind you, I'm in Nairobi, in the shittiest, smallest, dustiest Indian bookstore that there is. Grabbed this book, and it said "The Confessions of Aleister Crowley." I was like, Aleister Crowley. I know Aleister Crowley. He's like, that dude from Ozzy's song. And and of course, since I've been concerning myself against the evangelicals with this kind of topics, I knew already a little bit more about it. So I'm like, wow, I'm here in this place. I've never even seen any occult books in any of the bookstores I would frequent. I would go to bookstores all the time. So, and here it is. And then I just turned the page, and I was with the dove, holding the dove, it's like Saint of the Gnostic Church. I was like, oh, and Seek of the Hidden, oh my God. The Hidden Church. I was like, oh my God, goosebumps all over. It's like, got to get this book.
Mhm.
Got the book. I don't remember much about my internship, but I remember everything about the book. Read it like, all night long. And here I was, thinking, hell, there's someone who actually talks about the things I'm thinking about. There's actually someone interested in questioning the type of reality that we live in. And he seemed to be a super smart guy, you know? Plus, of course, with his antics, he appealed to my adventurous, youthful male side. Um, and during my teenage times, I was a very popular teenager, in the sense I had a lot of friends. I was very, I didn't have any issues with anybody, and that's in that way I wasn't a loner, or kind of like a sad goth or something, having constantly these types of identity crisis like some of my friends, when they were young. So none of this, but at the same time, I always felt, and that's maybe because I had shifted countries quite often, I felt that my questions in life or the things that really concerned me, apart from the teenager issues of, like girlfriends and issues with parents, and what people would talk about, would always be like, people could come to me and talk to me about their issues, but and it was not a problem, and we could talk about it, right? And we could discuss the usual stuff that is concerning to high school people, but nobody really was able to discuss with me the questions that really moved me on a deeper level. And these were always things like, I always felt that the reality I would encounter, especially when I was back in Germany. So sometimes we would live in Africa and we would go back to Germany for a while. I guess in my father's work, one had to go back to the home country for repatriation or something, getting, briefed again, and then go back a couple of years later. So I always felt that the things I was questioning, is there a deeper reality to life? Is that all there is? Are these questions that we have about girlfriends and issues, or even like, I know I feel so bad. Why am I feeling bad and everybody else is happy? These kind of things. I always felt, is there more to life than that? Or is that all there is? So, and then remembering all the books my father had in his library, all the books that I used to read as a child, because like we said before in our private conversations, we didn't have 100 TV channels, we didn't have internet, we didn't have like 1,000 opportunities to divert ourselves. So I was reading a lot, and in Africa, what you had was basically what was in the library of your parents, and thankfully there was some more exciting stuff than just maybe boring Hegel or Schopenhauer, but maybe also some Allan Kardec and other stuff from the 70s, which are a bit obscurer. So all of this kind of created a melange, questioning things, and then basically encountering Aleister Crowley firsthand through his, I guess also a little bit fabricated, autobiography, and it started from there then. And then I became a student in Germany, and however, there was quite difficult because, of course, being someone that has no roots, not growing up in Germany, not having a troop of friends, in a place that I grew up with and developed those interests together with, I was completely isolated with these interests. Germany, of course, you must understand, is especially after the Second World War, a super secular country. Everything that was not the Frankfurt School type of philosophical outlook was kind of questionable. Everything.
That's crazy. I was talking to Frater UD about this, and he said the same thing. In my mind, Germany's like the kind of cradle of a lot of Western esotericism.
Exactly.
But it's sort of, yeah.
This is what is interesting. Ralph is completely correct, because Germany was famous, of course, since the times even of the romantics. And even I remember, the German romantics, they're not like the British romantics. They're really dangerous because of really dangerous ideas, and from then on, of course, lots of occult streams and currents have developed in Germany, and even some of the Nazi leaders were not free from that type of influence, interests in these kinds of matters. And of course, we know of the myth making of the Waffen SS, or the SS in general. This, of course, not in an occult. Of course, there's this totally overdone, this occult roots of Nazism and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But there were people, because it was so center place in German's intellectual culture, this kind of engaging with esoteric thought. There were a lot of interesting philosophers, not only Nietzsche, of course, but also in the wake of Nietzsche, a lot of people concerning themselves with these like romantic, neo-pagan kind of like currents. It was also, of course, had to do with German history. Like with Germany, we were different with different countries, different kingdoms, and suddenly it came together. And one said, what is German? What are the common grounds of German nations? And so forth. So a lot of reasons why Germany had such a colorful, esoteric or spiritual culture, you could say, a diverse one, which then after the Second World War, the critics would look back and say like, oh, all of this irrationality, the breaking of these Christian veneer of morality, ethos, or ethics in that traditional sense, the collapse of humanity, in the concentration camps and stuff, and in total war, and the building of some warrior ethos, based on some type of mythic reasoning or unreasoning, some people, of course, would say, created this catastrophe of Nazi Germany. And after that, of course, everyone who would advocate for even in philosophical circles, German irrational philosophy, life philosophy, was a very strong power. It was actually one of the most exciting environments of German thought. And then then life philosophy was okay. Maybe Bergson was okay, but others, even Jung, Ludwig Klages, all of these people who advocated for vitality or this type of Dionysian, basically shutting down of the rational organizational structures for a more ecstatic life or ecstatic exposition towards life, that was considered obscure and potentially really dangerous. So you would have that environment in Germany where we all grew up so that's why the Christian churches in Germany have absolutely no power over anything. There are a lot of people who are still Christian in the sense of like being baptized or something, but the German Christian churches are the most secular of all. They're basically just NGOs at this point, and they have absolutely nobody's religious in Germany really anymore. And so I grew up in that type of environment. And so most people, they don't even have a philosophical tradition to fall back on like I had with my parents, let's say. So everyone of, let's say, a higher learning or who had a good education or came from a more sophisticated family was radically secular and radically rational, you could say, right? So me, with my obscure interests, the only people who would have an interest in these kind of things maybe would be people who study ethnology, or anthropology, or folk traditions or stuff like this, but simply then from a very rationalistic academic viewpoint. So for me, as someone who actually wanted to practice magical ritual and stuff like this, everyone I knew was like, David, you're such a cool guy. You're such a why are you really? Are you really are you that infantile that you are believe in like something like magic, or that even you even consider this to be something that is in any way worth a pursuit? You know, we knew of like teenage Satanists who would go to the like the cemetery and like do some candles and I don't know invoke Satan or something. But this would be like totally like loser kids, and once you're like over 18, 19, you would have grown out of this and you become normal. Especially however if you have a life, right? So this is and the people who are involved in occultism were like the worst of the worst. Like later on I found this out when I was actually involved in more organized occultism. So anyways, this was the environment I grew up in, so I started to study by myself. Try to get like Crowley books from the UK and Thelema from the US and stuff like this, and then write to the publishers to get some access to the O.T.O or organized occultism. Of course, I was like 17 or something, 18, and nobody replied. They thought it was probably nuts or something, or didn't have access, to publishers. So basically, I didn't. Then I went to study in Los Angeles. I went to UCLA for a while. And there everything changed. However, it was before the internet, right? No internet, no access, to anything except through personal contacts, I guess, or research. Frater UD, Ralph was more lucky because he grew up he was also a kid that grew up abroad when he was very young. But then, of course, he grew up in Germany with a peer group that was interested in these things. I wasn't that lucky. So when I was in LA, however, things changed. I went to a bookstore, and then suddenly you had a huge library of or access to a lot of Crowley books. I had to mail order them from America or England, And suddenly I had access, just went to, I don't know, Bodhi Tree or some other bookstore in LA, grabbed whatever Thelemic book I want, and out fell a business card from the O.T.O. And it's like, wow, the O.T.O has a business card? Like, holy shit. So was the hidden church, or the I don't know, College of the Elect or something, and here they are with a business card, and was like, interested in magic, call 1-800 I don't know, magic or something. I was like, oh man, this is a sign from the gods. So of course, this is how it started. And I called the O.T.O, called the hotline, and I got an access. And I had good times in the O.T.O, but it wasn't really what stuck with me, because this entire Western approach to magic, or this Western approach to reality, this transcendental focus, the focused towards sublimation, to basically mm, deconstruct a reality in favor of a higher reality that you can access, sublimation of bodily experiences. So the entire orientation towards the refutation of the blood and bones of the tragedy of life, of the transience of existence. All of the Western esoteric schools that I encountered had, in one way or another, no matter whether they were right-hand path, left-hand path, whatever path, they all had ultimately as their goal the overcoming of the transient person of Earth, in favor of a Superman, a higher person, someone who has developed transcendental access and basically could project himself out of this world into a more sublimated realm. So this type of theurgic ascent is prevalent in all modern systems, and it's logical because since, I guess, Plato, this kind of rationalization, transcendentalism, has become the ruling drive of humankind in the Western world, and now in the entire world, because it's the Western system which has colonialized basically the entire planet. And I've always felt at odds with this. I always felt it strange. It started off as smaller things. It felt strange to me that you would have rituals where, Golden Dawn ritual, something, oh my God, you didn't do that sign in that exact degree that was, supposed to, disaster will strike, for sure. Or, this type of very rigid kind of approach to magic.
Kind of Masonic almost, isn't it? That kind of Masonic, yeah.
Exactly, almost Masonic, very, very Western, very intellectual, but also very rationalistic. This has to be like this, and then all the people explaining to me like, well, since we're all a little bit more evolved and we're not superstitious, magic can also be seen as kind of a Jungian psychoanalysis. Whether the gods are gods or spirits or whether they're archetypes, it's all kind of, it doesn't really matter. And I was thinking like, well, it does really matter to me, because it makes a huge difference of what you then have before you, because it's not the same. The implications are not the same. So these things started to kind of like, crawl up in me. And then also in rituals, having the exact same rituals, one size fits all, basically, right? It was like a college, like, you go through the degrees, like you said, kind of Masonic in approach, and basically it doesn't matter who you were, it doesn't matter what you were, everything was the same for everyone, basically, right? I also felt that was kind of strange, because I thought the individuality of the candidate must be taken in account at some point, at least, and must impact the way one proceeds in the ritualistic or initiatic process. This also wasn't really addressed, because obviously, if you kind of like climb a ladder where you go from sphere to, everything is the same for everybody, because everybody's sublimating their, I don't know, transcendental personality, or their divine spark, or in the end, what you don't, you want, like the onion, you want to peel yourself off these layers of dross and develop your spiritual gold. All of these things were at odds with me, because I would remember Africa. I would remember the ecstasy of the rituals, the whirling masks, and dancers, and the ecstasy that would literally spread from the ritualists to the audience. This type of, in a positive sense, this pandemonium which would ensue in these rituals. However, it wasn't a pandemonium that was chaotic in the sense of there was no order. There was a totally different type of order present. Nothing was random. However, it was something that would root and celebrate the life as we have it here now. And it would not attempt in any way to escape this existence as we have it, but it would be an attempt to deepen it, or to make it more tangible, or to basically, even sometimes, of course, also moderate it or modify it, but always in the knowledge and understanding that, this is the reality that we live in. And there wasn't a theory or an attempt to basically project out of it, in a Gnostic sense, project out of the demiurgical or archontic realm into some type of either intellectual, mental realm of isolation, where now life becomes my playground and I'm completely detached, which never really works, right? I mean, we all know the super masters who totally fail at every step of their mastery. They're very agitated, irritating people very often. Fantastic ideas of, well, once we've opened the gates, now we literally project out and we're actually gone, or some kind of, so this kind of stuff, it just didn't sit well with me. And I was, and this is where we said, the setup that I had inside myself, the memories, the exposure I had as a child, the things I witnessed, the things I've seen, and also my own personality, I guess, was part of it. I was always a very physical person. I liked physical things. I liked, lovemaking. I loved everything that had to do with tangible experience. I wasn't a person who would sit and only intellectualize because I was afraid to engage with the world. Sometimes the world was overwhelming, but I always found it an adventurous thing to expose myself to it and see what happens, even if what happens could be potentially disastrous or dangerous. That's why in my later life, I've lived in all kinds of different countries and exposed myself to all kinds of different experiences. So you see, these are all things that created a certain kind of attitude towards spirituality. Then I moved from those Masonic kind of environments to what I believed was more affirmative of these tangible realms, the chthonic, Tellurian realms. And I moved into Michael Bertiu's environment, for which then I became quite well known, I guess. Then I became like the leader of Michael Bertiu's spiritual orders. Although kind of realizing quite early on that although it would use the terminologies and concepts at times of Haitian voodoo, for example, or of other more Tellurian forms of spirituality, or at least more, let's say, earthbound systems like, I don't know, Shinto or other things. Very quickly, of course, I realized, of course, the more prominent my position became and the more deeper I was involved, that eventually it was maybe the most idealistic and transcendental system I've ever encountered. However, it came in a very interesting environment, because it acknowledged, on the other hand, the chthonic, Tellurian, Dionysian, basically, environments, but only to use them basically as fuel to then project, and to transform towards a transcendental goal, basically. The monad, to conserve your monad and basically merge your monad with the supermonad, and then basically this way create a world of your own projection that becomes so magically empowered that it's the only reality that matters. So basically, it became, and of course, I try to. It was, on the one hand, I was really fascinated by it because it was so intellectually engaging, while it was seemingly chaotic. And of course, we know most people who are involved with this, they just take bits and pieces, the more fantastic sounding stuff, and it's something that frustrates Bertiu behind the scenes more than he would actually probably let out. And it kind of like makes him look, or it makes some of his work look goofy or problematic or weird, because same happened to Kenneth Grant, I guess, in some ways.
I was
People
about to
then,
say that. Yeah.
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 Although of course Michael Bertiu's work is a lot more philosophical, and people actually leave this on the wayside because he's so smart that a lot of his stuff is so complicated and complex, but also presented oftentimes in a very jumpy way, in a very kind of chaotic way, that it's very hard for people to kind of understand the systematics behind it. So that was something that I was, because I also was someone who cares for intellectual depth, was something I was very interested in. And however, I was, you could see I was torn between, two worlds. At the one hand, the Tellurian, chthonic, energetic, Dionysian aspects of it were really fascinating to me, and I thought those were the key aspects. But then again, there was this, to use the Nietzschean terminology, the Apollonian, transcendental aspects and goals, which were the more important ones ultimately. And ultimately, all the Tellurian, all the chthonic, all the Dionysian aspects were always inferior to the higher Aeonic aspects. So the demonic was always inferior, or depending on the Aeonic, you could say, right? Aeonic as in aeons, the higher power, the pleroma powers, or whatever you want to call it. And I try to reform some of it, to return more to the roots of the voodoo tradition that it claimed to emerge from, but that actually was only present in concepts which were totally taken out of its traditional context, which presented another problem, because people who came to the current were looking very often for a voodoo tradition accessible in the West, or maybe even westernized in the way that they could understand it better and move within it. And the problem was that it was often also in Michael's writings presented as that basically it is the voodoo tradition, but in more in its almost original form, before it deteriorated into some type of proto-shamanism or whatever, and it lost its transcendental. Well, basically, it lost its transcendental seal, which made it really important. And so basically, that's what is conserved here. So that was very problematic to me, because those were the most important aspects that I was looking for. But linking them back to my African experiences. And at that point, I already had retained some or reconnected with some African contacts that I had from my younger days, and had received initiation into some West African forms of spirituality, you could say. So that knowledge then helped me to provide a certain transformative process that then wanted to basically return the voodoo gnosis back to its chthonic roots, until I realized that if I would go through with this to the end, it would no longer be the system of Michael Bertiu, which had its own beauty and own value in its intellectual rigor, if we really understand it and if you take time to study it. It was a unique vision, in my opinion. It's maybe the most interesting Western esoteric system that we can, study, and study on our own even, because it provides, if you really care for that, a very interesting intellectual investigation, taking a lot of it from German idealism. It's basically a spiritualized version of radical German idealism. So I felt I would do an injustice to Bertiu if I would go through with this, because it would no longer then represent his system as, this intellectual, powerful system that you could actually work. And I say, if I don't, maybe other people want to work this, maybe other people want to be involved in a transcendental system, and if one wants to be in it, then that's probably, one of the most interesting ones to study. And you can do this by just going through those writings and do it, in your chamber. So I believe then, at that point, I moved on, and basically gave up my position, because me and also the close initiates that I had within that current were looking for that chthonic environment, that Tellurian environment, where being the mortal is not something to overcome, but by being the mortal, or being the mortal is something to explore and engage, and to actually place it, where it was and is meaningful, and that was then later on, or it still is, basically the focus of my entire work since, I guess, 2008, 2009, something like that.
It's interesting because I was going to bring this up later, about the kind of state of the current culture. But one thing I've really noticed, especially since just before COVID, I'd say, is that there seems to have been a shift in the culture, moving away from the kind of mass interest in Crowley towards this kind of quest for kind of authenticism almost. Does that make any sense? Like people are kind of, I think maybe because of this modern world we live in, where things feel so fake and kind of, like everything's a simulacra these days. Everything's a fake version of what it should be, I suppose. That people are looking for these kind of more authentic experiences, and a lot of people seem to find that in these chthonic kind of. You've seen this definite rise in chthonic kind of writing, especially recently. I mean, from your own publishing efforts, and
100%. This observation is 100% spot on and super important, because actually that has implications too. And sometimes, it's actually something that's very important to me, because I'll explain what I mean. You're absolutely right. I remember, must have been maybe 2006 or something like this. I remember sitting with Jake Stratton Kent. So it was, I think, before.
R.I.P.
It was, yeah. It was before the I think, the Oxford, is it Oxford Golden Dawn Symposium, that was on regularly, and that was like restarted. It was, I guess, around that time. And Jake and I were kind of friendly, and Jake at that time, was, basically, disappeared from the scene. He was kind of disenchanted. He had some, I guess, personal things to work through, and stuff. And I would encourage him, like, hey, go back out there, give some talks, do your shit, do your stuff. You have some interesting things to say. And and Jake was kind of like, he knew what I was doing, also what I was trying to do, still, in those days. And my strong focus on the chthonic and the basically recovery of the Tellurian and chthonic environments, for the Western spiritual culture, you could say. And he was the first to realize this, and to appreciate what I was doing. And then, later on moved in the same into the same environment, and we still always remain kind of close friends, him and Misha and all these people that I love a lot. And we saw this kind of, like you said, this rise of interest suddenly in, especially, during the pandemic, in these kinds of, and even before, in these types of environment. And Jake was clever enough to always acknowledge that in the West there was no living tradition which could provide a blueprint, or an initiatic pathway into this type of chthonic experience. And then that is why he had great interest in my background, and later on in Kimbanda and Brazilian magic and stuff like this, or Brazilian basically Afrocentric traditions of whatever color. because he knew these could provide clues, as with which to open up maybe some of the Western traditional forms of more chthonic spirituality.
It's interesting because in the UK, we didn't, like you say, there wasn't like a proper initiatic kind of system like that, but we did have this massive kind of oral tradition over here, which was interestingly, because we were talking earlier about this. One of the reasons I became interested in looking into the Order of Nine Angles so deeply was, not as intellectually rather than interactively, I suppose. Was because they claimed to have this kind of lineage that went back to these oral traditions that seemed
Yeah,
to
yeah,
kind
yeah,
of dominate the UK at this, they seem to, especially in a particular area, it seems to be around the Welsh area of England and of the UK, I should say.
but but we know there's, of course, the claims of towards oral traditions. I
Mhm,
remember, I remember back in the days, Andrew Chumbley also claiming all kinds of,
mhm,
witchcraft traditions, and I may step on some feet here, but of course I know these guys from like back in the days, and but of course, you know how it is. You need to create a mystique.
mm.
You need to create what's called legitimacy. You have
Legitimacy,
to
yeah,
be
yeah.
legit,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
how can you be legit if there's no transmission you can actually point to? It's oral tradition. Oh, my grandmother was a witch, my auntie
Mhm,
was, a witch, and stuff like that. Of course, but there are, of course, I'm sure in folk tradition there are remnants of a different kind of world experience. Of course, there must be, obviously, right?
mhm,
In Catholicism, there is for sure. For example, and even Chumley, for example, was very, very, very clear on that kind of understanding that you know one needs to go back to a transmission in order to access something tangible. And he was clear that in personal conversations with people, more than outspoken publicly, that witchcraft, for example, was transported within the Christian veneer and framework, and
mhm.
that if one wanted proper access to it, one had to pursue certain transmissions. So, he was looking at things like becoming a Gnostic bishop or something, getting a apostolic succession, stuff like that, Um, and I was involved with these types of environments back then, So the smarter people realized that, of course, in the West, we are basically, however, apart from hearsay and claims, we are lacking that kind of, at least we lack a firm initiatory environment that could provide this experience. Let's put it this way. And I guess the pandemic actually also, like you said, furthered the need for maybe even returning to something. Also, you couldn't meet with a lodge, right? It's kind of
Mm,
annoying.
yeah.
So, and so all these systems that had to have like regular group meetings, to do their 90-degree angle work, suddenly, you had to leave your daggers and swords at home and you couldn't do it. So, what's the answer? More interest in things like, oh, go to the forest by yourself, and connect to the forces of nature, elemental spirits, and stuff like this. However, which on one hand is an interest that I find very positive, because it allows people to look into alternatives to this transcendental kind of movements. And you could see it already before. Oh, you know people saying like, well, we don't. It's also the society that changed. When society became more woke, became more this, became more that, then suddenly like, oh, treating the spirits like, they're our slaves, or we have to dominate them and enslave them because we're dangerous. That's not okay. We don't want to like have that type of relationship. We want to have a relationship that's more friendly. So like, now they're our friends. So now, like, it's, instead of putting a demon in a triangle and basically forcing him to obey your will, now you kind of like hang out with a buddy and ask him kindly to do something for you, and he will get, I don't know, something back. So the problem I have, of course, with this, as you can see, since I'm overdoing it, obviously, is that it became a typical Western Western system or Western approach of how do you call it? Like something that pleases the current ethical mode. You know, um, treating spirits badly is no longer cool because we want them to be friendly. Oh, now. Um, the changing ways, the changing ethos of society, of course, reflects in spirituality in that sense. Um, and what I saw, and this is not only bad, of course, but there has to be change in spirituality, and not nothing stays the same. The problem, however, that we have in the West is that we have no existing tradition which could basically be adapted to modern needs, not so much to modern sentiments. And we can talk about it in the voodoo tradition a little later. I gave a talk just 2 days ago about voodoo and the secret societies of Haitian voodoo and other things where this is clearly addressed, where change, if it happens, is done in accordance, with a very deep foundation from which you operate, and then you can do change according to necessity. While in our culture, we do change, we kind of create and recreate our spirituality as we see fit, and how it is guided basically by our peer groups or our modern sentiments. And this becomes a great issue, of course, because that is a reflection of us treating spirituality as a commodity. You know,
Mhm.
today it's like this, but that's no longer cool, so I'll do it other way. Because
Mhm.
that's more acceptable. Oh, back in the days they sacrificed dogs to Hecate. That's not acceptable. I like puppies. But I spoke to Hecate and she said she also accepts gummy bears. So now it's gummy bears, like gummy bears, or whatever. Um, sandwiches or something, or hot dog, instead of a real dog. So you know um by overdoing it, and by being sarcastic about it, I try to just, however, hit home a point where
Mm.
we change and do things according to our sentiments, our ethical feelings of right or wrong, and because we don't come out of a tradition, we're not born into a living tradition. All we have is our supermarket of religion, and the religions we create for our own individual well-being, and that always usually reflects our current modes of how we feel about things. You know, when we are male and we are young and we lived, I don't know, in the early 90s, we are drawn to very edgy, sex magical things. However, maybe later on, I think people are afraid that the sex magical work is abusive. Now then we are let's deal with spirits only and sex magic not so much. And so our spirituality in the West very often reflects our sentiments and our actual society that we live in, rather than our society being modeled on a spiritual experience. you
Mm.
know like in voodoo or in other societies, there the entire society is structured around spiritual experiences or world experiences, where spirituality and life of society or individual within society are intertwined to a degree where they can't be separated. We no longer
Mm.
have this in modernity, right? So just to wrap up that aspect of the return to interest in these kind of more chthonic spiritualities, the problem I've seen there too is was like there was constant um, different things on Vogue. I remember there was Kimbanda, which was like the thing, right? Then there was voodoo, which was the thing. Then it was some type of Western shamanism that was the thing. So you constantly had a trend that people would follow, and they would just use a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and then the train would move to the next
Mm.
exotic sounding tradition. And why is
Mhm.
that? Because our own traditions leave us kind of hollow. And maybe the pandemic added to that, there's no practical anymore. we live isolated in big cities. The ability to connect to a lodge or to make these very complicated rituals in your living room with like lots of circles and brimborium is kind of like very hard to achieve. So let's go simple. Let's adapt to the needs of time. And however, then it was one trend basically, following the next, and nothing really stuck. Why didn't it stick? Because nobody actually would initiate in these traditions. These traditions would be presented in books. These traditions would be presented in chunks by people who would then transport them to other environments. And we in the West have forgotten um, to live within a spiritual tradition that we kind of stick with, right? We don't have this anymore. I mean, we talked about it before. We grow up in a world where everything is at our disposal. The supermarket of religion, I guess Max Weber was it who termed this, right? Is available at all times. You create your feel-good spirituality that fits in your everyday life. I remember, not going off on a tantrum, I hope. I remember that Oxford Golden Dawn conference. I remember there was one woman, I don't remember who was, talked about how she switched from Thelema and O.T.O, I guess it was, to Wicca or whatever, because once she had the experience that, oh, when I was in the O.T.O and I had kids, or I was in Thelema, I don't really remember, I guess it was the O.T.O, nobody would take care of my kids. They wouldn't have like kindergarten for the kids while we're doing rituals. But the other people did have that. So I changed because it was more convenient for my everyday life. And then I was raising my hand and I engaged her because it was so shocking to me to hear. Because it's like, shouldn't your profane life should be shaped not by your spiritual world and by your spiritual experiences, and not shouldn't you choose then your spirituality according to your social profane needs? For me, that was a shocking reversal of roles, basically.
I
Although
think
trying,
there's a
yeah,
kind of an issue around the subjects of confrontation, and
right,
quite a lot of spiritual, magical sort of work ostensibly is around confrontation and confrontation of the self and yourself
yeah,
in reality. And yet there's also, as you say, this sort of shifting and twisting things to convenience. And, that dulls down the confrontations, or confrontations that then get dressed up in a ritual context to become symbolic confrontations or sort of conceptual confrontations, rather than actual like lived ordeals where you just have to confront some real home truths about yourself or about the
very true.
world in which you're living, and then be moved to act and be changed by those confrontations. And I'm very much feeling that the confrontation and the challenge of persisting with things is diminished somewhat at the moment, certainly in the sort of magical field. And that's not to say that there aren't magicians, using that umbrella term, doing that sort of thing, but at the same time, that chopping and changing, given the example that you've just made about the sort of the inconvenience of childcare, which is a real thing for parents, and so that
I know about it. I'm a parent.
exactly. So then that becomes a challenge to actually engage with. It's a tests dedication and devotion, rather than sort of trying to go, well, how do I find a spiritual path that I can mold into something that just fits neatly somewhere after I finish work, but before I have to pick up the kids, and all of these kinds of things
I've heard
where
things like,
you
I'm a parent first and a occultist later, or a spiritual person later. I find that very problematic to say. You know, um, you don't need to be a bad father or a bad mother, because that is not the degree. You could see, however, in such dictums, you can see how spirituality and real life have divorced, and how they are then being put together out of convenience. And confrontation, like you said, people like to talk about it a lot, especially also like Western occultists. They talk about confrontations as long as they don't have any,
yeah
and also the confrontations they accept are only those confrontations which they find okay at a certain point. As soon as it's a confrontation which is put upon them against their will, or against, let's say, against their idea of that this is okay at this point in my life, they will refuse it. This is why, of course, Western esotericists or Western spiritual people hate oftentimes the idea of a teacher. The teacher is a disturbing factor because he may point out your bullshit, or he may put trials upon you which you're not ready at a certain point to face. And if you have a teacher, you only want to work with him as long as he doesn't demand unreasonable things, in the sense of like, well, that doesn't really fit in my life right now. So, and then of course, immediately the teachers are bad, teachers are abusive, teachers are, I don't know, this or that, while in traditional societies, the idea to have no teacher, no spiritual mother or spiritual father is unthinkable, like literally unthinkable. When you tell people in Haiti, in Germany or in Britain, there are people. Most people say, well, you don't need a teacher. You just go outside and meet the spirits, because they're just waiting there for you, and you just pour a little bit of booze and you smoke a cigar and announce yourself, and then suddenly they're there and play with you or whatever. For them it sounds like an absolute infantile nonsense. And immediately they know they cannot have general spiritual experiences of having spirits, because if that would be the case, it would be so disastrous, or it would be so powerful, that they wouldn't, like they do, jump from one thing to another, or kind of like speak about the spirits as something that is nonchalant, easy to handle. For me, the fear of trial, the fear of confrontation, the fear of a teacher is, of course, reflective of who we are. We are raised as individuals. We are hyper-individuated in the West. We are being told from an early age, don't let anyone tell you what to do. You're you, do your thing. Make sure that, I don't know, you put your will through in life, you need to achieve things, make sure, you as you kind of like stand up against the currents of time and the world outside, assert yourself against the world as an individual. And everything that threatens that integrity of your individuation is rejected. And it is only accepted insofar as you think it sublimates it. So the teacher is accepted only insofar as he tells you what you really want to hear. And it's only okay if maybe he tells you to do certain things and then you do it, and you feel super spiritual because, see, I'm working on myself, like I'm doing the meditation. He told me to do meditation 3 times a day and I'm doing it, like, I'm such a good student. But the moment the teacher will tell you something that's inconvenient or real confrontation, you will not do it. You will find reasons why that's unreasonable, that can't do it, the teacher is bad, why you need to move on to another thing. Another story I tell quite a lot is about a Sufi encounter I had we talked about Istanbul before, amongst us, right? I was in Istanbul and gave lectures in Istanbul for the Turkish audience on Gnosticism. And then there was a Sufi, a Syrian Sufi, that listened to some of my talks, and he said, like, well, it's what you say is so interesting because, you speak as a Gnostic bishop, but my Sufi master says literally the same things, just in different language. But I feel like you guys have a lot of stuff to talk about. You align so well. Do you want to meet him? I was like, oh yeah, it would be super interesting for me because I studied Sufism quite a lot and intensively for years. So yeah, long story short, that guy brokers the invitation, and I'm invited with 1 or 2 of the people I was there, students and stuff, to go there. And we were, kind of like the honorable guest of the master. And so we participated in, like, some of the Sufi rituals and banquet and stuff like this. And then there was at one point one of the usual question and answer moments. So they would go in a room, and there was, once a week, the students could ask questions to the master, right? So the master would sit there and the students could ask, and it would be things from like mundane things like, oh, I'm having a problem with my husband, how can I solve this issue, to something like, oh, I went to an exhibition on Sufism or Ibn Arabi, and the scholars would say this, and what do you think about this, and to other things, spiritual matters. So there was this English, the only person who wasn't a Muslim by upbringing was, and the only Westerner in that sense was a girl from England, who apparently later on then turned to be kind of a spiritual student, who was in India for a while working with a guru. Then she moved on because it was not her thing. She moved on to study Sufism in Istanbul. So me and the master were talking with a translator, that Syrian guy was translating. And then this woman would raise her hand, and she was, however, a beginner, right? She was only there for a couple of months, and then she would ask questions. She said, well, you look, and it was like when I was quite young still. I was like, I guess, early 30s. And it's like, for a Gnostic bishop, you don't look like a bishop. You look like a rock star. You have long hair, you have earrings, I don't, you don't look like, a spiritual master, and so that was translated to the Sufi master, and you could see he got irritated, right? And then I was, however, saying, and the Sufi master, however, himself was quite a young guy, like 35 maybe, or maybe 40. And it's like, well, your Sufi master doesn't look like I believe a Sufi master, looks in my cliched idea. He doesn't have a turban, long beard, and is about 70 years old. He looks like Omar Sharif, about, to go to the next scene. He's like a good-looking young man, So sometimes, the outside does not betray the inside status of whom you're encountering. And then the Sufi master, loved my answer, obviously. And then he would ask this woman in broken English, are you Sufi or are you English? And she's like, I'm Sufi. And he's like, no, you're English. And she's like, okay. And she was kind of pondering. And then, like 20 minutes later, she would ask the next, like, completely irrelevant, nonsensical question. And then the Sufi master again, like, kind of really annoyed. He was like, are you Sufi or are you English? And she's like, oh, I'm a Sufi. And she's like, no, you're definitely English. And then, why are you, what did you learn? What would a Sufi do in this moment, in this situation? And then she would think, and then she would be like, shut the fuck up. And he's like, exactly. And then he told me later on, like, this is the problem with Western people. In the Sufis, in such a moment, two masters speak, and if I'm the guest of the Sufi master, I must be an important person, or must be someone, that you have to respect because the master respects you, right? So no matter what you think about the person in your brain, you wouldn't disrespect the master by disrespecting the guest, who obviously is meaningful to the master, right? So, the Sufis would sit, the younger ones, the ones who's, and younger, I mean, like, who has started only more recently, they would sit in the back and listen to the smarter ones or the more experienced ones talk and learn. You learn by silence. You learn by shutting up. And he said the Westerners, the Westerners he has doesn't last, because the Westerners come to get validated. They come, they have an opinion, and they believe their opinion and their opinions are as valuable as anything else they will ever hear there. And if they do not, in the course of their studies, get the validation they seek, either as great spiritual advanced people, where the master is like, well, you're my super student, you're gonna be constantly patted on your back for your great advancement. As soon as you criticize them too much, or as soon as they feel other people that maybe have started out with them progress faster, they see a competition, they get irritated. So there's this mindset that a Westerner comes with into spirituality very often, is so destructive, even if they have an earnest type of outset with which they approach things. The way they are programmed by modernity, or by the Western way of thinking, by the logocentric way of thinking, by the individuation they have created, and by the individuality they have, which doesn't allow themselves to be deconstructed too much. The I, me, the sense of me, you cannot destroy it. You cannot deconstruct it, only as far as I allow it. And in Sufism and in other traditions, of course, the most important thing is to deconstruct yourself to the degree where the greatest enemy within, the Satan within, that which doesn't want to be deconstructed and which comes up constantly with reasons of why this is not okay, where, this is of course the greatest enemy that needs to overcome. And in Sufism and most other traditions, they say you can't do it on your own, because that's this sense of I am is so strong that nothing within yourself can bring it to break, because it would twist and turn, and sneaky in a way that, and then the Sufis, I don't know if that's the proper concept, but I interpret it as this: they have the positive darkness and the negative darkness, and then these darknesses separate. The ones who fall into the lower darkness, the negative darkness, are the ones that believe themselves to be great initiates, but haven't conquered that sense of self, didn't allow it to be deconstructed, but basically take an outer attitude of humility and of like, I transcended every profane sense of self, and now I'm a spiritual master, but however are exactly the opposite of that, while the other ones move further after being deconstructed, and of course, and in Sufism towards a more transcendental goal, merging with the divine spheres and so forth. In Voodoo and other traditions, however, the deconstruction takes place in order to connect to the world of the spirits, to connect to your metet and other spirits that are meaningful to you,
Mm-hmm.
And we in the West have laid such emphasis on individuality, and on individuation. Our entire way of thinking is like this. And even if we say we would like to overcome this to a degree, right? Even then, we are still rooted so much in that, even our way of thinking in general, the way we approach the world, the way we think about, like we said before, I don't feel well with Masonic type of Western rituals. I want it more simple, because I look at Voodoo, I look at Kimbanda, I look at, I don't know, spirituality in the East. I want the same. So now I want to go outside and meet the spirits. I want to, reconnect with nature. The thing is, already that approach brings with it logocentrism, and it doesn't change anything, because what you're doing is you go out and you want something with a preconceived notion. You project what you want to find. You project that you want to find a simpler way. You project that you want the spirits to accept and acknowledge you. You project that you want to find spirits. You want to go to the mountains and find the genius Loki there, and for sure you will find it there. You will go there and you will sit there and you meditate and you will feel something, right? And then you said you met the genius Loki, and he said you this and he said you that. So, even if we have a genuine, maybe even intellectual understanding that the things, how they work, cannot go on like this, and maybe a reform is necessary, the way we go about it and the way we approach these kinds of systems, we approach them with a logocentric insulation in our system, which doesn't allow us to actually open up these systems or even this approach to the world in a tangible way. And what happens is we start to kind of like hypnotize ourselves a little bit into that, maybe even into that aesthetic experience. But it is not what it is for, let's say, a biocentric individual, like a person within voodoo culture, or an Amazon, indigenous tribal person, or even, a person in ancient Egypt or in ancient Greece. The way these people experience the world is a fundamentally different world experience than the one we have. They don't come from that complete closed up, isolating self, but they are much less individual. Another funny thing I sometimes say is, I remember there's a kind of an insult that in some African countries in West Africa they call it like you individual you. It's kind of an insult. If you call a person as individual, like you're such an individual. Because personhood is one of the most important things to consider. The personhood in Africa, for a normal, even not a highly spiritual person, but we need to remember spirituality in Africa or in other places is not separable from normal society. The society is built on on a collective and individual relationship with the outer world, the cosmos. That relationship establishes a cultus, and that cultus then dispenses all the rules and the initiatic processes that a person goes through in their lives, from youth to manhood, or from youth, to womanhood and so forth, and we don't have this. We approach the world from this entirely insulated situation, and we see this also in things like psychoanalysis. We say like, well, you always assume the individual is a monad, is an entity to itself, that you can know yourself kind of fully, or at least establish relationships with that which is an enclosed, encapsulated entity, that may be connected to some collective unconsciousness and stuff like this, but it's not really the outside world, as in the cosmic outside world. It's always, an insulated individual that needs to fortify itself to intrusions which deplace your own sense of self, right? And all kind of analytical work to get you to know yourself better, to root out your weaknesses, to overcome certain things. This is, of course, all attempts within yourself to organize this monad better, right? And make this monad more productible, or more able to sustain itself in the modern world. And this, of course, translates to spirituality, right? The supermonad, right? The merging with the divine, or becoming the Superman. The will to create the will to power. To make the world subjected to us. These kinds of things basically manifest in all the things we do in our lives. We approach the world by immediately deconstructing what we encounter. We always come into things with a preconceived notion of what we want to find. Even relationships, of course. We want our girlfriends to be like this or like that, and we project and we try to change them, and we do, everything. Our analytical, projecting, rational mind already preconceives what we want to find, so nothing can really reveal itself to us freely, because immediately as soon as our gaze turns onto it, it becomes already an object that's opened, to our analysis, deconstruction, possession, and basically grip. And everything that evades this is irritating to us, and we try to change it, right?
I've just been doing I've just been writing a long monograph on the role of cognitive dissonance and ritual, and the potential sort of deliberate applications of cognitive dissonance in ritual. And that the cognitive dissonances that arise from when you have a lived experience that is fundamentally at odds with your preconceived ideas. When you have those experiences where you're not just encountering what you anticipate or what you imagine, when you have those experiences that make you go, "Oh, I've got this fundamentally wrong," and the discomfort that is cognitive dissonance, that tension and that sort of realm that lies between those two realities that you've just experienced that are conflicting, and the power, the transformative power of being able to stay within that discomfort without that need to immediately justify or reconcile or undermine anything back to a position of comfort and security. Sorry, I'm just sort of chucked that in because it's kind of following on from what you were saying.
No, because that's actually, one of the most, this may be one of the only tools at our Western disposal, short of being within an initiatic tradition, which provides this type of experience. Because, of course, you can see Bataille or other people, trying, this type of, unselfing or deselfing, decapitating, your rational mind, to open yourself up to a different type of encounter, or some people, of course, it's also very in vogue now, doing psychedelics, or doing ayahuasca and stuff like this, which I remember from back in the days before it was so trendy. The only problem is, of course, that very often, if you do not have a referential framework in which to place such experiences, they become fractured, isolated moments of such an experience, and then by necessity they become like icons of experience, which then you necessarily have to analyze and deal with in order to kind of make sense of it, because of course that's what we do. We don't have a referential framework, and this is the difference, of course, when you are lucky, maybe I don't know, be in a tradition naturally, as we said before, that provides an entire world experience where all these, transitions or metamorphoses that we are going through in our lives are addressed as aspects of a greater relationality that grounds what we would call a world or a society or something which we as individuals are related to. In the West, we don't have that, right? In the West, we only have ourselves and maybe fractured experience if we're lucky, if we're very lucky and can achieve what you just explained. We can have, because of course it's, we must then rely on and hopefully believe that this was a genuine experience of that type, that the decapitation really worked, and that experience we had was a genuine experience. And if we had it, however, where do we place it? We no longer live in a community that's basically structured according to such experiences, or that is basically even allowing such experiences to have an overwhelmingly important function. So, you're then considered a weirdo or an odd person, or like someone that dabbles in like unnecessary things, because you're pursuing your, like, I don't know, weird interests. This is how usually people like this are, evaluated. And, unless we have, because of course, when we talk about personhood in these traditional societies, an individual without a society or a community doesn't exist. Like a person that is not related to a community is an unperson. It's literally like you don't exist. And we know these stories even from the Germanic, even ancient English times. When someone one of the greatest, most horrible punishments was outcast from society. You'd be outcast from your community, and everyone could kill you or destroy you or whatever. And this was not the roaming bands of outlawish youth, who for a while transgressed, but this was like the person who was disconnected from community, which meant he didn't exist, and anyone could do anything. And these people, we must assume, actually felt like they didn't exist as persons anymore. And why is that? Because in those times when personality was understood, and in Africa, and I give an example, like in Africa, in traditional societies, in voodoo too, personhood is not a monad. Personhood is a kind of a puzzle of various different components, different souls, aspects of a spirit, aspects of stars, all kinds of different things make up personhood, right? And this type of personhood is always moving, is always changing. And this personhood is always related and linked to the outside world. So things can come in and out, they traffic in and out. So you're always being made and unmade in a constant exchange with the outside world. And the same happens with the person related to the society. You understand that, you exist only in relationality. Existence is acknowledged as depending on relationality, while in the West, or while in modernity, it's not only the West, modernity has covered the entire planet. We learn that we are good on our own. We don't need relationality. The left-hand path or other occult systems say, like, the world is our projection. We create the world according to our image, right? And that is the opposite of relationality. This is the absolute refusal of relationality, and the absolute objectification of the world, which, however, in my opinion, then completely divorces us from every type of vitalism. In the end, it sounds powerful, but we encapsulate ourselves in a phantasma, in a simulacrum, in an illusion, in which we are the supreme king. And we all know these, especially sometimes left-hand path lunatics, like weird Lord Belial, in his mummy's basement, however, thinking he is a superhuman and his will to power has triumphed and everybody else is a slave. These delusional types, right? And it leads to that delusion, um, so that kind of insulation, this kind of inability to see that our entire existence is rooted in relationality, which Heidegger so cleverly said, even if you're most inframed, right, there's always that great mystery, death, which always tells you there's something over and beyond yourself that is absolutely and always out of your control. You can make up all the fantastic stories about Summerland and paradise and whatever, or be an atheist. These are all your own projections of how it would be. Oh, Summerland is going to be nice. Or we do pagan, dances all day long, and or we are being in paradise where we all holy sitting on the cloud and playing harp and stuff, or whatever we consider to be an image that we like to make the idea, the anxiety, the awe of death more acceptable to us. Because why has death become such a negative or anxiety-inducing enigma for the Western world? Because we are such strong individuals. Our individuation is so powerful that death is not concilable, or is not connectable to us as the I am, because death means the I am no longer exists. So I have to either make up a story that my I am will live further, of course, without any scientific proof. And that's why, because modernity works with science and control, we know this is a story. And, the anxiety is still there because, maybe it's not true. So then maybe faith helps, and you can, and you have that moment where faith is not strong enough and you get anxiety, you get panicked. So the problem with death as no longer being a structural element that determines the way we live our life, and that death then in former times, or even in natural societies now, is not something that people are afraid of in that sense. It's still a mystery. It's still an enigma. It's still an ultimately awe-inspiring event, but it's something that basically becomes a structural element because it always reminds us that we are constantly dying, and the way we live our life is determined by us being mortal. That the ancestors or those who went before us imposed something upon us, a way of life, traditions, whatever, and that death itself, that we cannot escape, is that great enigma, which is a cosmic thing, is not a transcendental thing. By also moving death and afterlife out of the cosmic experience, basically also basically renders impossible the opportunity for the dead to be present and the dead to have an influence on our lives. In natural societies, of course, death is a huge event, and however, nothing in the cosmos, and that's actually, I guess, also a scientific thing, nothing in the cosmos that withers away or dies is lost. Energy is just transforming, right? Everything is just moving about. So if my body decomposes, it still is moving in different places, I guess, right? And in different environments. It nourishes plants. The actual energy is not lost. And the idea that the dead influence the living, that death is on the one hand the shelter of life, that Heidegger also so very well explained in his later life, that death becomes that which charges us with a certain with a charge that necessitates us to live life intensively, as deep and as powerfully as possible, to connect with the ancestors, to again enter into a relationality. That's something that we have lost. by pushing death away, by conserving the I am, by no longer being able to experience in our everyday life our constant, basically unmaking. In voodoo, which I just talked about voodoo 2 days ago. The idea that you're constantly unmaking yourself, that the way you try to influence your life too, of course, sometimes with rational ways, sometimes not so much. Sometimes you understand that some problems you have, you need to mediate, so the cause of your life is a mediation, trying to work, with you're constantly with yourself in movement. You're working with the outside forces so that maybe something doesn't impact too hard on you. You mediate it, and you're constantly working with what you have and mold it according to the circumstances around you. And so you experience this unmaking and constant metamorphosing, because you have a world in which this is explained and experienced all the time, especially also in the important moments of your life, when the youth becomes an adult, when the warrior society makes the young acolyte a warrior, or but in our society we no longer have these moments, because you're always the same, you're always the same throughout your entire life, and we no longer have the moments where you move from one status to another. You gain a name, you gain manhood, and then you are no longer that person, or the name you've been called with as a child no longer applies, because the new name now is who you are, and you are a new person. You're constantly reborn through initiatic processes, and this is something that's tangibly experienced and explained by the society that's built upon these concepts. And this is what we are lacking. So our outside world doesn't reflect and mirror these kinds of relational processes, and our own individuated self that has been getting more individuated for the past, I guess, 3,000 years, I guess, has now entered, I guess, in history, the most solidified position, where most of our lives takes place online. We are no longer the body. We're no longer in the body. We're constantly obsessed with the body as an object, to shape it nicely, make plump lips and get big boobs, and get six packs, and even the kids 14, 15 years old, they now go to the gym, because I don't know, the influencers they watch have six packs, although they are 10 years older than them or something, and it becomes a cult of object. It's an objectifying treatment of the body. Although people say, "Oh, I'm totally in the body," but of course they're not. The body becomes an object which you shape and form and turn into a perfect machine, to do your bidding. Where your will to power is, basically manifested more strongly in a machine that can put it through, and that kind of further and further divorce from the tangible reality goes hand in hand, however, with the delusion that, however, we have all the options. Like, look, now we are talking about all these beautiful neo-animist and polytheist system that we're all returning to. Now we take strolls in the park and talk with spirits there, rather than, I don't know, being a lodge and being stiff and dusty with old dudes, wielding swords. So now it's become, so suddenly everything is at our disposal, right? The internet, like you said before, the internet provides all the information. Nothing, is secret anymore. No mystery. And that opens another Pandora's box,
Oh yeah, mystery is a big thing for me. This
Yeah,
rejection of mystery that I think humanity in general. I was thinking about this in relation to David Lynch after he died. I always respected his refusal to explain the mysteries of his art to people, because I think he realized that when you sit with mystery, it has this sort of effect on people,
Right.
but generally we're sort of trained these days to reject mystery and
Right.
to become more cynical human beings, aren't we? And
For sure.
it's quite rare when you come across an artist these days that still swims within the kind of waters of mystery and
Right.
in fact kind of embraces it. I think it's a hugely important thing, personally.
And more rare, even people who allow a mystery to remain a mystery and who do not try to lift the proverbial veil of Isis. That was a sacrilege. To lift the veil of Isis and see what's behind it, is a horrible thing. And I remember being in South America, and there was a mountain, and it was in Peru, like lots of years ago, in the 90s, traveling in kind of remote places, and there was that mountain, and the indigenous people would never go to the top of the mountain. They would sometimes do processions just beneath it, right? To give I don't know, like gifts to the mountain god, who was their most important god, because obviously the mountain had such a tremendous effect on the fertility of the land, and so forth and so forth, right? So of course immediately the Westerners, they would say, like, let's climb that mountain, let's go on top of it, and then they would ask them, hey, why you never climb the mountain? Are you not curious? Oh, you use the holy mountain. Are you not curious to see if your God's on top, or if you can see something on top because it's so holy? And that's because they would say there's so many mysteries. The God lives there, right? And there are so many mysteries, around that summit, and the entire mountain, obviously, but the summit especially. There are all stories around it. And then this was typical. The Westerners would never allow mystery to remain a mystery, but they would immediately want to see what's up. And then of course, if there is no God to be found there, everything is just a children's story. They didn't understand, and this is the horrible thing, right? They didn't understand that the local people didn't have to go up there to find a God, because the sway of the mountain, their relationality, their openness towards the atmospheres which would descend from the mountain, the demonic power that the mountain would impose upon the people, demonic in the sense that it moves you, right? It had such a strong effect that all the stories were simply a way, of course, to communicate about it, and to basically establish a relationship with the swaying atmospheres of what they are encountering. They were of course not children thinking there is a floaty guy sitting up there or something. They wouldn't expect to find one there. But of course, they wouldn't go up there because they wanted to retain the sacred space as sacred space, which for the Westerner is an unthinkable thing. We want to know, we need to know. Knowledge is power, right? And or Crowley, like, magic is science. It's none of this in those traditions, right? Magic, spirituality is all about mystery. It's allowing the other to stand out and pour itself forth, and not pour itself forth for you to deconstruct, analyze, and basically make it understandable towards, to your own individual, rational knowledge, but in order for it to sway you, to impregnate you, to move you. And once you have understood and exposed yourself to this, you can see how, not only you are swayed by the demonic atmospheres of the world, but you yourself become a part of that, mirror play, Heidegger would call it, or, the dance, the round dance, and only this the world we establish now is not a world, is a wasteland, because the world we establish now is a world of our own rational projection and the rational agreements we make by definition. This is the world we have. And it's the Western capitalist, consumerist way, which has spread all across the globe, and nobody is free of it. There are no, and this would be another, of course, romantic idea, oh yeah, there are these people who live untouched, but it's all bullshit. There are basically next to no untouched people. So we have to address the fact that we live in a veneer, of projection of a world that is an unworld, in a sense, right? And we have to recover a world that is established by relationality, by allowing things to basically not subjugate each other. Neither we subjugated by the world or oppressed by the world in a sense, but neither we subjugating the world by deconstructing it all the time, but understanding that we have, as mortals, as Heidegger would say, as mortals, we have a special place in the interplay of things. Because we, of course, as the mortals, we are the one where the cosmos comes to appearance. We are the only ones who have this kind of reflective capacity of reflecting the cosmos. An animal only has it to the degree where it's synchronizes with its instincts. A plant only moves according maybe to the sunlight and so on. But we as human mortals, we have the ability to gaze the cosmos in its complexity, and that gives us a special place in the whole movement of things. But the hybris of humanity, to think that we are the sole dominators of the cosmos, the sole makers of the world, is completely insane, and will lead only to more delusional experiences or behaviors, and a world that's an unworld, a world that may change. And this is the whole most horrible thing. And this is the thing that I learned from Heidegger more than anything, that the enframement that we experience, the veneer, let's call it in our conversation, of the unworld that we have projected, leaves us the illusion of ultimate possibilities. And we have so many competing idealisms, right? Oh, should we be more woke? Should we become more left, more right, more this, more that? And these battles, which are important in many ways, on a tangible level, on an immediate level. However, they take place under that big umbrella where my projection, my idea of the world, my idealism is more important. It's best for everyone. I remember a Thelemite saying, "Oh, these stupid Christians, don't they realize, they should all become Thelemites? Don't they understand we only want the best for them?" I'm saying, the idea of like somebody wanting the best for me and then kind of like, forcing me to convert, that sounds awfully, like other things I've heard before, which didn't go very well,
Yeah.
So, this to me is a very, very important point, that, in a world that seemingly is the most free, where things are the most available, that is the most dangerous, because we, the Gnostics would say, we live in an archontic world where we are given the illusion of freedom, and we think by all our choices and by all our battles we fight for this idealism, or I'm with the Green Party against climate change, or no, I'm that's bullshit, blah blah blah. All these battles we fight, as important as they are on some level, they keep out of sight what Heidegger would call the question of being. We are so amassed in the world and the little things that are going on, and the important little things, that we do not see the big picture that keeps us, in place as logocentric and framed individuals. And this ties back in with what we said about spirituality, nature, the love for neo-animism, neo-polytheism. And here also we see, however, people move from trend to trend. Then there's this author who he's the new influencer of, I don't know, neo-animism. Oh, we read the books. And then there's that guy. Oh, and then now this is not on Vogue anymore because, I don't know, there was a little bit of, let's say, oh no, he didn't present this well. There was a bit of neo-colonialism in there. And now, like the Jacobins, they fight each other, and then, the revolution eats its children, and they move on to the next. We no longer have the ability to open ourselves where meaningful, powerful experiences sway us to the degree that they leave us so shattered and shocked and destroyed, in a sense, that nothing will ever be the same. Even when I used to work with people in the Western esoteric tradition, I say, well, that was a powerful magical experience. This ritual was so powerful, blah, blah, blah. It was more like, we did a ritual and everybody had their, the sensations were there, the atmosphere we created was cool, and everybody had a aesthetic experience, but it is nothing in compared to, let's say, a voodoo possession or an encounter with a voodoo spirit when it happens to a Haitian or to someone who is open enough to have the Haitian-like experience, which is, of course, available to a Western person. You don't have to be a Haitian to have a voodoo spirit possess you, or you can have the same experience in a Western environment, but it's much harder for a Western person because we're so closed up. But once you have it, it's so shattering, shocking, scary, awe-inspiring that you could never deviate from that. You can only move from path to path, from teacher to teacher, from paradigm to paradigm, if everything leaves you kind of bored. It's like me, and this band was cool, now I don't like it anymore, now I'm going to move to this one. Oh, I was interested in that topic, now I'm interested in another one. We live in a consumerist world, and spirituality has become a consumerist marketplace. Nietzsche was right when he said, the real prophets are not heard because the clamor and chattering of the marketplace drowns the real voices. They just want the excitement of the circus. They want the rope dancer to dance, and not hear what Zarathustra has to say, for example. So
I think there's sort of kind of carrying on that same thing and going back slightly to what you just said. This sounds really negative, I realise. I've certainly had encounters with other magical practitioners and engaged in rituals who, as you said, sort of had seemingly profound ritual encounters, experiences, and then one is kind of left questioning, how did your life change? What did you do differently after this? How you just actually carried on with exactly your same life, and now you're setting up the next ritual experience, which will be seemingly profound. But again, if it's not causing those fundamental changes that is going to make you change the direction of your life, or then it becomes about thrill seeking, or just that sort of
100%.
just in it for the experience, not in it for the actual change. So it's just like, yep, I'm really, really up for change as long as I don't actually have to change.
100%.
Which is a really negative
This
way
is
of
one
saying
of
it.
no, it's actually the exact right thing to say, and I'm known for saying these kind of things, and they need to be said, because if we look, I don't like talks or presentations or podcasts where everybody just pats each other's back and say, oh, we're all the same, all roads lead to a spiritual realm. I used to be the one who always says, like, we're not the same, we don't do the same things, we're not in fact all the same because we're all spiritual or on a spiritual path. The contrary is the case, the opposite is the case. And I personally always enjoyed the talks best, which kind of left me a little bit confused, or sometimes even kind of like at odds with my own convictions or something like this, which made me question things. But of course, if you say these things today, which are too controversial, you're going to have a shitstorm because, oh my God, he said, like, how can he, that's opinionated and he's devaluing other people's spiritual experience. How can he say that? How can he do that? So, however, people must realize it's one thing to just mindlessly criticize and tear everybody down. But it's another thing, however, to criticize something severely and present an alternative and say, I'm criticizing this. And in the end, personally, people can do whatever they want. If they want to live the way they live, if they want to be the most transcendental ever, or if they want to, be neo-animist or something by just going out and doing childish things, they have kidnapped from other traditions, and rendered it simple. Go ahead, do it, and feel good about it, and feel holy, spiritual, and super, connected. It's okay with me. But I'm trying to talk to the people who are still capable of serious, sophisticated, deep, and disciplined spiritual work, and those few who may hear, what we're actually talking about, what we try for 2.5 hours, I guess already nearly, or 2 hours at least, to bring across, something which, for the few who have the capacity and to overcome all the trappings of the modern world, may have the chance to actually enter relationality. And I'm a strong advocate for teacher-student relationships, initiatic tradition, and actually community, magical community, but a magical community based on initiation. Because I do not believe that you can be this self-enclosed occultist, which just does its own thing, and you're your only reference, your own personal gnosis, and who are you to say that's not my experience and stuff like this. I believe if you do not have a community with which to ground the world, and the world can only be grounded, if you enter relationality, because a world only is founded upon relationality taking place and then something happening from it. A birth, a pregnancy and a birth has to happen, and this cannot happen in the vacuum of your head, but it has to happen, with the outside world. And a community which celebrates these kinds of relationalities, you could say. And as humans, we are, of course, closely connected with other humans, whether we want it or not. Even, the hermit in the mountain, the desert father who escaped society, is, however, funny enough, I've said it this the other day as well, he's the most strongly determined by society, because obviously he tries to escape it, society is disturbing to my spiritual work. Oh, all the sins and all the problems and all the, issues there. I need to seclude myself to be closer to God, blah, 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 blah. So, however, his entire life is determined by that society that he tries to escape, right? So someone much less determined would be someone who lives in society and tries to work things out there, but I do believe that in our modern world, it's very hard to live a meaningful relational spiritual life with the majority of people, because the majority of people just don't operate that way. We can have nice friends, and of course we can have nice, pub moods and stuff like this, and we can have nice rituals. For example, I find it totally meaningless to have like these rituals that sometimes people do. We all come together and everybody participates in a ritual, and everybody brings something in. I find that absolutely meaningless. Like, because it's just a random. I understand the effort behind it. I understand also the nice, beautiful community idea behind it, but it betrays the infantile approach to spirituality that we have arrived at. That everything is just wishful thinking. It's okay. We're all the same. We all want it so bad. So we all celebrate spirituality together by doing a ritual where everybody just mumbles something, and I always contrast this with voodoo, where I'm initiated, right? I was initiated as a voodoo priest in Haiti years ago, right? So I've been and stayed and experienced Haitian spirituality as an initiate. It would be unthinkable, something like this. It would be absolutely unthinkable that people would come together just randomly and everybody throws in something, and then people think this is a genuinely powerful spiritual experience, as powerful, as meaningful, as whatever, as people would have it within a voodoo ritual, for example, that's done in Haiti in a voodoo honfor, I think it is necessary sometimes, like you did it, to say the hard truth, to voice it, even if we run the danger of being, a kind of like disliked for it, or where it's like, they said some cool things, but that's kind of dogmatic, that you can't do this, and who are you to tell me this, well, for sure, anyone can think whatever they want, I do not want to impose any of my views on anyone. I just want to basically offer a different perspective, and I believe for a different liaison to the world, if we truly want to have a more meaningful relationship with the world, that's more than just wishful thinking and a well feeling because we do things right. We are not anymore such nasty people. If we want to really break through to a spiritual experience where our entire life becomes revolutionized by it, we need to tell these people out there the hard truth that this can only come with a fundamental deconstruction of self And to achieve this, in my opinion, is only through a teacher-student relationship. And of course, there are really bad teachers out there. Like attracts like. The modern person attracts the fraud. So, I know it's hard. I know it's difficult. I know it's problematic. But the quest is worth it. And the attaching yourself to a tradition that, on the one hand, maybe acknowledges the Gnostic issue at hand, that we live in an enframing, that our individuated state of looking at the world and dealing with the world is so powerful, that whatever myth we use to talk about it or to deal with it, however, needs to be addressed first. How can we strip back the layers of insulation, which then allows us to expose ourselves to the world in a different way, in my opinion, a more meaningful way, without becoming, again, imposing upon what we want to encounter, what we want to find. And once we manage this, our relationship with our world becomes, or the world outside of us becomes totally different from the way it is now. And I don't know if you guys have read the new edition of Faceless God, or the essay I had in there. It's called Children of the Abyss. It's an essay I wrote in Thomas Vincenta's new edition of Faceless God.
I've got the original, but not the reprint.
The new edition is something I really recommend. Not only because the book Faceless God is expanded and very important, editions have been made by Thomas. Also, I have provided an essay which addresses some of these things we've talked about today, and especially also it addresses something simple. It addresses waiting, and this is something that I've learned from Heidegger. We've talked about boredom before, right? The ability, like, we never wait for things. We always expect things to come, and we already know what we're waiting for. See, the idea of waiting for us has become, we're waiting for a new girlfriend to come to my life, the holiday to be great, the new job to be amazing, the next year to be cool. But what we have lost is the ability to wait for nothing in particular, to release the control over what we expect to come. So, to enter that hyper simply sounding but very difficult state of waiting for nothing in particular, but just waiting for something to arrive, what arrives by its own accord. Only by doing this, something has the chance to actually arrive. And it's not even the arrival itself that's important, but by waiting for something to come that we do not project beforehand, opens within ourselves a demonic quality, because it opens up relationality, the possibility of something that comes towards us can encounter us. Because if we wait for something in particular, or if we already know what we hope for, we already have an image. We already create an idol of what is supposed to come, and then nothing can come undistorted, But if we manage to wait, in that sense that I try to quickly now throw into the field, releases or basically frees us from the need to control, the need to dominate, the need to project, the need to make something basically controllable in our lives. But, releases this demonic quality of allowing something to unveil itself towards us. Because
that phrase you just said, the waiting for nothing in particular.
Exactly right.
It's a really nice, concise little way of describing that exact.
Exactly.
There's
waiting for nothing in particular.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Yeah, and
sorry, carry on.
And by that, something has the chance to arrive and sway us, because we do not expect anything in particular, right? And then it can even be small things. And then, in my opinion, spiritual experiences, people, these people as much as I do, thrill seekers, you've correctly nailed it. It's exactly the people today. Esotericism, magic, occultism is just one more modern thing to fill your time with. It's a commodity. It's a consumerist market that's at our disposal, and people use it. And thrill seeking is a very big part of it. Young men seek pretty chicks naked on the altar. When I was in the early 90s, that was still okay to I guess crave when you were young and a male. And now, whatever, your demons to pop up and destroy the temple because they possessed some nerdy initiate, whatever it is, right? It's thrill seeking. And I believe, and I've found out that while these things happen, right, profound spiritual change also often happens just slowly, seeps in, and gradually you're transformed. This constant metamorphosis, this constant making and unmaking in the interplay with the outside, right, is something that gradually takes place, and may only show its bigger effects later on. But if you do this in a meaningful way, and if you understand the big picture within which you place this kind of proactive, pathic activity, activity not in a frantic way like we start, but in a pathic proactivity where you override your will to power and make it a will to life, or something, where you use the will to power to strip your own impositional behavior back. That creates change, and if you are lucky enough to have a community or a world experience that surrounds you, that already has established a community or a world in which these things are meaningful, you find them mirrored back to you. And that's why you need a community. You need the experiences that you're making in that Gnostic transitional progress or process. You need to have them mirrored back to you in order for them to unfold. Because, as we said, we cannot be our own monad that just falls back upon our own analytical occupation with ourselves all the time. Because if that happens, we again insulate and enclose, and we have no outer reference to mirror things back to us. And it cannot be just random people. It cannot be like, oh, my cat is my teacher, my child is my teacher. Yeah, they all teach us something, I guess, but in a meaningful, esoteric way. And when I talk to you guys, I only talk for and with people I consider serious esoteric practitioners. I've been around the block for 30 plus years doing these things, in a serious way. So these are the people I want to address, not the person who, for good reason, will listen to your podcast and have a good time with it, which is also great, right? I love people who buy, say, on publishing books simply because they like the intellectual approach or because they find it like well written. That is not bad in itself, you understand? But I think when people speak about when they speak about those big things, right, then you have to speak about them properly. And you also have to kind of like tell the warts that go with it, that this is not a do as you please self-made spirituality that you stitch together, out of the supermarket of religions to practice, 1 hour a day when you're super engaged. But it is a transformative process that must take in so many more components and is extremely hard to achieve, especially if you're in a more isolated place. And here comes now the last thing on that area, on that environment. The internet is great on that level. You don't necessarily anymore need a physical community that you have to live with in order to ground these experiences. That is a good thing if you have it, much better. But the internet or the digital realm allows you to connect with people all over the world. So you can establish a community with people all over the world. And of course, in my case, the people I work with, we are all over the world, but we do meet, however, regularly in person. We have meetings in Europe, we have meetings in the States. I'm going to travel to the US later this year to meet with students there, because I believe that is another important aspect. To ground community, there must be the flesh and blood relationships as well. But if you are a person like when I was starting, like we said before, in Germany, knowing nobody, being new in the country, coming from Africa, coming from abroad, being a stranger to my own German soil, it's great if I could have had people on the internet, at least, that I could relate to and relate with. That's great, and guys like you with a serious podcast and a serious mission in that sense, provide, in my opinion, a super important service to let serious people to allow serious people to link up with serious practitioners, or at least be inspired to kind of rethink some of the things, and the rest of them have a good entertainment where maybe they can get good inspiration for their daily life, because you don't have to be. Not everyone is a great spiritual practitioner. Not everyone has the capacity, the time, the will, the talent to be a great master. This is also a bullshit story we hear all the time. Everybody can be a master. Everybody can be a great this, can be a great that. That's not the case. Not everyone can be, an Olympic swimmer. Not everyone can be, I don't know, a math genius. I certainly can't. So, however, this doesn't mean that you couldn't work with things. This doesn't mean you couldn't maybe attach yourself to a community in which a spiritual life becomes meaningful. A spiritual life doesn't mean you have to be an initiate in that sense, a magician, not at all. Or even like, a high degree. We have to also lose the idea of chasing degrees, this again is chasing status, is cementing your personality, your cult of personality is something you need to stop doing. It's your relationship with the cosmos that counts. And that can come in a million different ways, but it has to be done right.
Yeah. Well, awesome. I think even though we haven't, we were originally going to talk about the Black Cube, but I think maybe we should do that in another episode if you're down
definitely.
for it.
The Black Cube.
Yeah.
I'd totally love to talk about it. Yeah. Another time.
Brilliant. but it's been amazing. It was as good as I hoped it would be. So
thank you guys.
Really, really interesting.
Yeah,
me too. I enjoyed it a lot. It was great, and I'm looking forward to a new chat with you guys in the future. Absolutely.
Definitely.
I really liked it.
I have to do it sooner rather than later, definitely. But excellent. Thank you so much. That was really good. Thanks.
Cheers.